Classic PBJ, uploading what should have been a very niche Halloween episode 2.5 f***ing holidays late. Been busy, you know how it is. Anyway, I don't really think I need to over-explain who John Carpenter is to any of you guys. You know, prolific director, screenwriter, composer, made a very solid horror film back in '78 and then decided that wasn't good enough and turned around to make the greatest horror film of all time right after. He's clearly very talented and knowledgeable about this sort of thing, and I am a huge fan of several of his films. With all that said, he gave this interview back in 2018, which was just brought to my attention, and in that conversation, he explained his take on the differences between left-wing and right-wing horror, coming to a conclusion that I can only describe as deeply confused and generally a little bit retarded. But I'll let him cook for just a minute and then I'll explain what I mean.
It's one of the two scary stories that we can tell. One is the evil is inside or the evil is outside. Right-wing evil is always outside. It's them. Different color skin, different way they talk is different. Now that goes way back to us tribal. We're sitting around the campfire and we've just come out of the trees. And the witch doctor says, I'll tell you where evil is. It's out there in the woods, in the darkness. It's the next tribe. And they're going to come in here and things will be impure. And they'll take you over. That's right-wing evil. Left-wing evil, same situation. We're sitting around the campfire. Witch doctor gets up and says, I'll tell you where evil is. It's right in here. And he points to his heart. It's in each of us. We have the capability to commit evil. The good man chooses not to and fights against those impulses.
So to be frank, it should be apolitically agreed upon that this is a pretty shallow and limiting way to think about storytelling that is also just wrong in a pretty objective sort of way. Dudes in blue ties and dudes in red ties should be able to dap each other up on this. I haven't even started writing why yet, and I'm already positive that this framework for viewing films will fall apart under the tiniest bit of scrutiny. But it's a framework that I'm actually going to stick with throughout this video for the sake of argument to try and answer the question, if there were a political binary within horror media, what would it actually look like? My guess is that it's nothing like Mr. Carpenter has imagined, but let's find out. The key issue I see with this outlook is that Carpenter's examples, evil coming from quote-unquote the other tribe, and evil existing in the hearts of us all, outside of the issue of those really fundamentally being the same thing, are actually both rooted more or less in the right-wing worldview. The idea that people are deeply flawed and fallen and capable of great evil by default, a skepticism of human nature itself, is really not the traditionally left-wing view at all. Because at least in the Western world, that belief stems predominantly from the Christian worldview upon which the West was built, even if that's fallen out of style. And the solution for that inherent darkness would be that people need adherence to a higher order or moral code, and need to reject certain desires in order to stave off evil. And even in the absence of Christian faith, I don't think I need to tell you which side of the aisle tends to have more self-restrictive and value-driven behavior. The more traditionally left-wing perspective on humanity is that people are generally good by default, and that it's society, the overarching power structures, or our negative experiences that forcefully mold a few of us into slasher villains and serial killers. And I'm not here to tell you which perspective is true, I'm just looking at the data. Now obviously a lot of horror doesn't deal with a human terrorizer, it might be demons or big bugs or aliens or some shit, and I do think Carpenter is more correct in attributing these narratives to the right-wing perspective, not just because these kinds of evil do come from that other tribe he talked about, but also because these stories have to presuppose the existence of the good and the evil, or at the very least, the morally superior and the morally inferior in a given situation. This is another somewhat religiously rooted perspective that the secular left wing has not been on board with for several decades at this point. Far more commonly on that side, people adhere to some variation of moral relativism. Moral relativism being the idea that all ethics are ultimately subjective, and that we really aren't capable of accurately casting moral judgments. Again, these aren't one-size-fits-all ideologies amongst our two clans, but they are predominant here in the West. But you see the problem so far, right? When you take Carpenter's framing and just apply reality to it instead of trying to take lame pot shots at all the Trump bros, you realize that Carpenter just accidentally made a case for the vast majority of horror storytelling being inherently conservative, at least on the implicit level. And I don't think that's true, because I think the entire line of thinking that leads to it is a fucking crime against media literacy itself. But let's keep running with it. If stories about an inherent evil are, by their nature, right-wing, regardless of what tribe that evil comes from, then it would follow that the other side of the aisle consists of films which depict a circumstantial evil. Movies starring blameless, or at least initially blameless, victims of society on one hand, or media which sets out to undermine real societal values and traditions on the other. As for the former, that might be a video game like Outlast, where every single immediate physical threat is just a tortured soul who is driven mad by mistreatment. Mistreatment at the hand of a massive, shadowy organization bent on pure evil, no less. And as for the latter, you might look at the kinds of films that make it onto your typical YouTuber's disturbing movie iceberg. Your Serbian films, your August Undergrounds, that kind of shit. Films that are made as a direct fuck you to power structures and culture, and films that understand the audience's values and traditions, and subsequently do everything they can to spit in the face of them. And I'm not personally a fan of any of the three examples of media I just gave, but I'm sure if I wanted to devote more time to this fever dream of a video, I could think of fantastic works that fall into these categories. This isn't a let's own the libtard sort of thing by any means. I'm just doing my best with Carpenter's framework. And what's so interesting to me about these points in relation to Carpenter is that while his tone during that interview implies to me that he's rather left-leaning, Halloween 1978 has this almost inarguable right-wing framing. Michael Myers is not the result of tragic circumstance or being from the other fucking tribe. He was a well-off, well-loved kid in suburbia who happened to be a seed of pure evil for no reason. That was the entire point. He can't be cured or reasoned with or fixed with social services. He's raw evil due to the simple fact that raw evil does exist, and it requires the morally good Laurie Strode to put a stop to him. While the need to make money with sequels ensured that she and Dr. Loomis wouldn't be wholly successful, the ideological leaning seems clear. And don't read too much into me saying this, but asking the majority of those on the political left what they think about, say, the death penalty, should make it clear they're not in favor of evil being identified and expelled, because again, they generally don't believe in the concept of pure evil. Now, there are a couple videos that cover Carpenter's take first. One is by this fella named Greg Kahn, and the other was mentioned as a part of a longer video from a fella named John Doyle. One of these guys took Carpenter's claim more or less at face value, and as a result was very wrong in pretty much everything he said, and the other was rather skeptical and made some good points. Points I find myself reiterating here, in fact. I'll have both videos linked below in case you're curious and want to draw your own conclusions. Frankly, I find it a little boring to discuss a take I already agree with, so I want to focus on Mr. Kahn for just a short while. He also discussed Halloween through Carpenter's lens, but as you'd expect, he labels it as left-wing. Basically, take every point I made a minute ago and just believe the exact opposite. That's about where he's at. There's nothing very interesting about all that, but things do get all kinds of autistic when he decides to take a stab at Rob Zombie's Halloween film from 2007. I'll play a little bit of that now.
Rob Zombie has a way of pointing his camera at his subjects in an almost hateful way. It feels like he's pointing at someone and saying, ew, look how gross and fucked up this person is. The Myers home in 2007's Halloween couldn't exist anywhere. It's the perfect blend of abuse, neglect, and poverty that destines Michael to be a cold-hearted killer. It couldn't be anyone. It couldn't happen anywhere. It happens because everyone around Michael is cruel to him. The Myers family does not belong in this community. They are clearly outliers. And thus, I'd argue Rob Zombie's Halloween is patently right-wing.
So it takes some mental gymnastics, but he concludes that because the Myers house in that film is so fucked up, Michael is in fact from the other tribe, making it a right-wing narrative. Now the unfortunate bit is that, like Carpenter, the guy has a solid grasp on storytelling in general, he just doesn't like conservatives. Well, I should say he and most people who try to dissect media don't understand conservatism to any extent beyond whatever their preferred flavor of propaganda tells them. So he says things that, to a lemur, make sense and sound kind of right, but his logical starting point is so backwards and up his own ass that he will never arrive at a sensible conclusion, even though outside of all the politics, our takes on the film are actually pretty similar. And quick side note, I swear I don't want to just pick on a random guy, but he also claims that the film being critical of Michael's mother for being a well-known prostitute who lets violent deadbeats around her children is, quote, right-wing bullshit.
Not to mention the weird anti-sex worker stuff in this movie. They undercut Michael's first murder with his mother pole dancing at work, as if to say, see what you did? Your kid is a murderer because you're a sex worker. If that ain't some right-wing bullshit, I don't know what is.
Maybe I'm just a little old-fashioned, but if that's really all it takes to be a right-wing bullshitter, I think I'm just going to give in and buy the Alex Jones game. Another side note, Rob Zombie's Halloween is just so fucking bad when it comes to everything but the visuals that I don't really blame the guy for wanting to be mad at it. The characters are abysmal even if the actors weren't bad. The overall writing is bordering on incompetent and disrespectful to the source material. And it was a take on Michael Myers that doesn't work because it misses the entire point of Michael Myers. This time, he's not pure evil, he's a sympathetic victim of his terrible environment, which funnily enough actually gives the film more of a left-wing framing. This guy's gonna be pissed if he ever figures that out. Rob Zombie's take on the character was a Michael that does care for others, if only a couple, and who was gradually molded from birth into a psychotic freak from experiencing abuse and neglect. He's not truly to blame, and he isn't some force from outside of society who barrels in. He is a clear product of society. This is completely in line with what any honest person would consider the left-wing viewpoint, which tends to eschew personal responsibility and attribute poor behaviors and outcomes to outside forces to a greater extent than its counterpart. Admittedly, I did not re-watch that film before writing any of this. This was a very spur-of-the-moment type of video. So I'm speaking based on memories from a few years ago. Please feel free to let me know if I've forgotten something important. Anyway, I think now is a wonderful time to revisit a crucial caveat. It is most definitely not the case that the majority of horror filmmakers or the majority of the horror audience are of the right-wing persuasion. I would wager it's pretty clearly the opposite. So I don't think that the majority of horror films are setting out to deliver some kind of fucking subversively red-pilled message. The issue is when we're working within this binary frame, when we apply that kind of narrow view, and in this case a view that clearly tries to paint one side as being far superior to the other, the right just comes out looking better, in a way that I'm sure Carpenter did not intend, like in the case of the two Halloween films. This binary really only covers the foundational elements of stories anyway, and there are probably thousands of examples of media with a right-wing framing that have messaging which most would interpret as pretty left-wing. We can take a film I really liked, like Ari Aster's Midsommar, for example. It's one of the most directly other tribe narratives we've seen in recent years, to the extent that even Carpenter would apparently label it right-wing. But the actual story and messaging of it is interpreted by most as being the exact opposite, if anything. And I think there's a lot of reasons conservative thought tends to be prevalent, even if unintentionally, when making horror. For one, these are stories about struggle and survival, and conservatism is the more inherently cautious and protective ideology. Another might be that horrifying situations are, by their very nature, a radical change for the people experiencing them. And given that we're typically inclined to root for said people, we have to root for their more situationally conservative behaviors and ideals in the face of horror. But at the end of the day, I don't really know, guys. I love horror media, but until like a week ago, it wasn't something I often brought politics into. But Carpenter's rant just stuck out to me as egregiously misguided. And given that it's probably something that way too many people have just agreed with without much thought, I wanted to bring a little input. If I'm wrong, please feel free to let me know. If there's things you want to see from the channel in the future, please let me know. Next video coming probably pretty soon, no promises, and I'll talk to you guys later.